The letter had been hidden for over a century, carefully folded and sealed with wax, tucked away deep in the archives of an old southern plantation. The discovery, when it came, was completely by accident. An unremarkable researcher, perhaps too eager to sift through forgotten documents, stumbled upon the letter wedged between two heavy tomes, its faded ink barely legible, but unmistakably urgent. It spoke of a child, a girl not yet fully into her adolescence, who had acted with a kind of courage that belied her years. Her name was Sarah Harrington, and she had harbored a wounded runaway slave named Elijah for 9 long months during the height of the Civil War. The letter, written in cryptic language, conveyed the danger, the secrecy, and the unimaginable moral weight carried by such an act. But what was perhaps most haunting about it was the suggestion that the discovery of Sarah's actions had changed everything. The letter's author, a local historian from a century ago, could not fully explain the profound impact Sarah's secret had on the town of Edgewood, Georgia, or how it rippled outward to affect both the lives of those who knew her and the fates of those who had been touched by Elijah's flight to freedom. And yet, the letter hinted at something darker, an unsettling conclusion that suggested the truth of Sarah's choices had never been fully uncovered, and that, over time, the memory of her actions had been clouded by the shadow of something unspeakable. As the camera zooms out from the fragile piece of paper, we are transported back in time, to the thick, oppressive humidity of a southern summer. The land stretches endlessly, dotted with the looming silhouette of a once proud plantation house, now decayed and crumbling. Overgrown vines crawl up its walls, and the broken windows tell a story of abandonment. This was Edgewood, once a quiet, prosperous town, now barely a memory in the broader sweep of history. The camera lingers on the fading traces of its former grandeur, the rusted iron gates, the cracked cobblestone paths, the forgotten garden overrun with weeds. The house itself, where Sarah had grown up, seemed to whisper secrets to those brave enough to walk through its halls. No one dared enter now. It was as though the very air around the plantation held the echoes of stories long buried, stories of fear, of betrayal, and of an act that would have consequences too far-reaching to predict. The narrator's voice, calm and deliberate, begins to weave the tale of that moment in time. It was 1864, and the Civil War was ravaging the southern states, the conflict splitting families, towns, and allegiances. The southern economy, reliant on plantations and the labor of enslaved people, was crumbling under the pressure of Union blockades and military incursions. The Harrington family, wealthy landowners who had once held sway over the town, found themselves caught in a tightening vice. Their plantation, once a hub of industry and productivity, had become a place of deep unease, fraught with secrets that were too dangerous to acknowledge. Sarah Harrington, only 12 years old, was the youngest child of Richard Harrington, the harsh patriarch of the family. Her life was one of privilege, or at least, the kind of privilege that came with being born into a world where the labor of others was hidden behind the gates of an estate. She was rarely seen by those who worked the fields, isolated from the enslaved people who toiled on her family's land. To Sarah, they were mere shadows, silent, invisible figures who did not exist outside of their roles as laborers. She was raised to believe in the superiority of her family's station, and yet, there was always something disconcerting about the air within the walls of the plantation. Something was wrong, something unspoken, but undeniable. By the time Sarah was 11, whispers had begun to swirl through the estate. The war was becoming impossible to ignore. The Union soldiers were coming closer, and the families who had long been on the right side of history were now being forced to reckon with the violence and destruction surrounding them. The plantation, which had once thrived, was slowly suffocating. Richard Harrington, despite his staunch support of the Confederacy, could do little to stop the slow erosion of his fortune. With the death toll mounting and the reality of the war settling into the town's collective consciousness, things began to change. It was in the midst of this turmoil that Elijah, a young man of 23, appeared at the plantation's gates, severely wounded and barely able to stand. He had escaped the clutches of a Confederate regiment, surviving a journey that had taken him through swamps and forests, dodging patrols and hungry dogs. Elijah had been a slave on a neighboring plantation, forced to labor under brutal conditions, but his decision to flee came not just from the desire for freedom, but from an overwhelming need to survive. The plantation's owner, a cruel man named Jacob Turner, had grown more erratic as the war raged on, his treatment of his slaves becoming harsher with each passing day. Elijah's escape, though dangerous, was the only option left. Sarah first saw him on the evening of his arrival. She had been walking through the garden, her frail figure silhouetted against the dying light of the day. She noticed a man standing by the fence, looking lost and desperate. He was covered in blood, his clothes torn, his eyes wide with fear. Despite the starkness of his appearance, there was something about Elijah that moved Sarah. She could see the pain in his eyes, the kind of suffering she had only glimpsed in passing, when her father had been particularly cruel to his workers. But this was different. This was not a servant punished for disobedience. This was a man fleeing for his life. Without thinking, Sarah crossed the yard to him, her small hands trembling. She spoke softly, telling him that he was safe for the moment, but that he must be hidden from her father. Elijah, too exhausted to respond, simply nodded, and for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of what she was about to do. To harbor a fugitive would be a betrayal to her family, to the very system that had protected her. But her heart told her otherwise. She led Elijah to a small, unused room at the back of the estate, hidden from the main house, and instructed him to stay silent until she could bring him food and water. As Sarah returned to the house that night, the realization of what she had done settled in her chest like a stone. She had become an accomplice in a crime, and yet, she couldn't bring herself to feel fear. For reasons she didn't fully understand, she felt a strange kinship with the man she had just saved. She had always been taught to see people like Elijah as nothing more than property, but now, something had changed. The lines between right and wrong blurred, and Sarah found herself trapped between loyalty to her family and an undeniable compassion for the man she had promised to protect. The cold open ends here, lingering on the image of Sarah standing in the dark, staring into the abyss of her decision. What was she about to become? What consequences would her actions have on the people she loved? As the screen fades to black, the haunting realization settles in, the journey had just begun. And Sarah's story would, from this point forward, be defined by the choices she made in the shadows. The town of Edgewood, Georgia, had always been a place of secrets, where the past was buried beneath the weight of its own history. It was a quiet town, nestled in the southern reaches of the state, where the air was thick with the heat of summer and the smell of earth. The sounds of cicadas filled the air during the day, and at night, the rustling of the trees seemed to echo the unspoken stories of a time long gone. The town's landscape was a patchwork of cotton fields, dense forests, and rolling hills, a place that had once flourished under the brutal rhythm of plantation life. But now, it was a town at the mercy of time, weathered by war, neglect, and the erosion of its own identity. The Harrington plantation had been the heart of Edgewood, its sprawling acres a testament to the wealth and power of the family that owned it. The large, white plantation house stood at the center of the estate, its columns grand and imposing. The windows, once brightly polished, were now cracked and covered in dust, offering only a faint glimpse into the past. The house had always been a symbol of the Harrington family's dominance, their wealth built on the backs of the enslaved people who worked the land. The plantation had thrived for generations, its owners untouched by the outside world, wrapped in a bubble of privilege that shielded them from the suffering of those they enslaved. Sarah Harrington had been born into this world of privilege, though her life was far from the idyllic existence that one might imagine for a child born to such wealth. The estate, while grand, was a place filled with tension and unspoken rules. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in on her, and Sarah often found herself wandering the halls alone, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had few friends, certainly no companions her age. Her brothers were older, busy with their own affairs, and her father was a stern, distant figure, consumed by the demands of the plantation and his unwavering belief in the Southern cause. Her mother, too, was a distant presence, wrapped in the duties of a woman in her position, her days filled with social gatherings and her nights consumed by worries over the war. Sarah's childhood was marked by isolation, though not the kind of isolation that stemmed from poverty. No, her isolation was born from something else, a coldness, a distance that was inherent in the world she was born into. Her family's wealth was built on the suffering of others, a fact that Sarah was not yet old enough to fully grasp, but one that seemed to linger in the back of her mind, like a faint shadow, always just out of reach but never truly forgotten. The plantation had its own rhythm, its own set of rules that governed every aspect of life. The work of the enslaved people was demanding, grueling, and seemingly endless. The cotton field stretched as far as the eye could see, and the workers toiled under the harsh southern sun, their lives measured in long, exhausting hours. The overseers, men employed by the Harrington family, ensured that the work was done swiftly and efficiently. They were the enforcers, the ones who maintained the rigid system of oppression that kept the plantation running smoothly. The enslaved workers were treated as little more than tools, machines to extract wealth from the earth, and the family turned a blind eye to their suffering, for it was simply how things were done. Despite this, there was always a certain unease on the plantation, a simmering tension that Sarah could not ignore. The enslaved workers, though outwardly obedient, carried with them a quiet defiance, a resistance that was hard to miss if one cared to look closely. Sarah had often overheard hushed conversations in the kitchen, where the enslaved women whispered among themselves, speaking in soft voices about their hopes for freedom, about the world beyond the plantation, about a life they had never known but dreamed of constantly. There was an energy in those whispers, a kind of resistance that Sarah couldn't fully understand, but that she could feel all the same. Her father, Richard Harrington, was a man of unwavering beliefs, shaped by his upbringing and his place in the world. He was a staunch supporter of the Confederacy, a man who believed in the righteousness of his cause, who believed that the Southern way of life was worth defending. His views were shaped by years of tradition, by the power his family had held for generations. He was proud of the plantation, proud of the wealth it had brought him, and he saw no reason to question the system that had made him who he was. To him, the enslaved people on his land were nothing more than property, tools to be used, but never questioned. Sarah's mother, Margaret Harrington, was a more passive figure, her role defined by the social expectations of women in the South. She had once been a young woman of beauty and grace, but the war had worn her down. The toll of losing family members, of watching the world around her crumble, had left her distant, her mind preoccupied with the future of her children and the fate of their estate. She never spoke much of the enslaved workers, and like her husband, she seemed to turn a blind eye to the suffering that was so clearly evident on the plantation. She lived her life in a world of appearances, concerned more with the image of propriety than with the reality of the system that supported them. As the war raged on, the plantation began to show signs of strain. The once bustling estate was no longer a symbol of wealth and power. The fields were no longer as productive, and the overseers, fearful of Union raids, grew more cautious. The workers, too, had begun to change. There were whispers of rebellion in the air, of a quiet resistance that Sarah could not ignore. She had overheard conversations, saw the glances exchanged between the enslaved people when they thought no one was watching. There was a restlessness in the air, a sense that the world was shifting in ways that could no longer be controlled. It was during this time of increasing tension that Sarah's life would change forever. The world around her was crumbling, and she was trapped in the middle of it. The plantation that had once been the heart of the family's wealth and power was now a symbol of the disintegration of everything they had once known. And it was in this setting, this backdrop of social decay and moral conflict, that Sarah would encounter Elijah, the runaway slave who would forever alter the course of her life. The tension between Sarah's privileged existence and the brutal reality of the world she inhabited was palpable. She was a child in the midst of a war that was not only being fought on the fields of battle but also within the hearts of those who lived on the plantation. Sarah's role in the story was one of unexpected defiance, a young girl who, despite her sheltered upbringing, would find herself drawn into the very conflict that had been kept at arm's length for so long. It was this tension, the clash between the innocence of youth and the brutal forces of history, that would come to define her choices and ultimately shape the fate of those around her. And yet, As much as the landscape of Edgewood had shaped Sarah's world, it was the people who lived within it who would ultimately determine her future. The town of Edgewood, with its long history of secrecy and unspoken rules, was a place where stories were buried beneath layers of time and memory. The truth of what happened in the shadows of the Harrington plantation would remain hidden for years, the legacy of Sarah's actions only beginning to be uncovered long after the events had passed. The haunting question that lingered in the air, unanswered for so long, was whether Sarah's story would be remembered as one of defiance and courage or as one of tragedy and betrayal. As the winds of history shifted, the town of Edgewood would be left to grapple with the legacy of its past, one that could no longer be ignored or erased. And it was in this legacy that the true nature of Sarah's actions would eventually come to light. The world she had known was gone, but the echoes of her choices would remain, etched in the very fabric of the town's history. The Harrington family had long been a fixture in the South, their name synonymous with wealth and power. Richard Harrington, the patriarch, was a man of towering presence, both physically and in terms of his influence. He carried himself with the air of a man who had inherited not just land and money, but a legacy that demanded respect. Born into a family that had owned vast tracts of land for generations, Richard had always believed that his position was both deserved and ordained. The plantation, which stretched for miles, was a symbol of his family's success, a reflection of the strict social order that had defined their lives for as long as anyone could remember. Richard's power extended beyond the plantation gates. It seeped into the town of Edgewood, where he was known not only as a wealthy landowner but as a staunch supporter of the Confederate cause. His beliefs, rooted deeply in the customs and traditions of the Southern aristocracy, never wavered. To him, the war was not just a political struggle, it was an existential one. The very fabric of his world, the social and economic order that had sustained his family for generations, was under siege. And Richard, ever the defender of tradition, was willing to fight to preserve that world, no matter the cost. Yet beneath the surface of Richard's commanding persona lay a more fragile, even fragile, sense of security. For all of his pride, he carried within him a fear, perhaps unacknowledged, but undeniable, that the world he had so carefully built was beginning to slip through his fingers. The war was taking its toll on the South, and the Harrington plantation, once a self-sustaining powerhouse, was now struggling under the weight of blockade and battle. The fields, though still cultivated, no longer produced as bountifully as they had in the past. The enslaved workers, although still bound to the land, had become increasingly resistant, and whispers of rebellion and escape filled the air. The plantation's once glorious facade began to show signs of wear, the wood began to rot, the paint peeled from the walls, and the once immaculate garden became a tangled mess of wild weeds. Richard's wife, Margaret Harrington, was a woman who had long since accepted her role as the dutiful wife of a man of stature, though the war had taken a toll on her. Margaret was known for her elegance, her grace, and the quiet strength with which she ran the household. Unlike her husband, who wore his beliefs like a badge of honor, Margaret carried hers more privately. She had long since made peace with the reality of her situation, her family's wealth, her position, and the expectations placed upon her were inseparable. Yet even she could not ignore the changes in the world around her. The war had begun to affect her health, the constant stress wearing on her body and mind. In private moments, she often wondered what would become of her children when the world they knew came crashing down. Sarah, their youngest daughter, was raised in this environment of privilege, though she was unaware of the full weight of what it meant to be born into such a family. To Sarah, the plantation was a kind of kingdom, and she its princess. She had been isolated from the larger world, protected by the thick walls of the estate and the sense of security that came with her family's status. As a child, she was often confined to the large, dark rooms of the mansion, her days spent in quiet solitude. Her interactions with the enslaved workers were limited to the brief moments when she was permitted to observe them from the distance of the house. She knew they existed, of course, but they were little more than shadows in her world, figures who lived outside of her realm of understanding. Sarah's father, Richard, took great pride in his control over the plantation and its people. He ruled with a heavy hand, maintaining a strict order that ensured his dominance. The enslaved people on the estate were treated as little more than tools, their labor exploited to fuel the family's wealth. Richard was a man who saw no contradiction in his actions. In his eyes, the system of slavery was not a moral issue, it was an economic necessity. The people who worked his land were there to serve him, and their suffering was an unfortunate but acceptable byproduct of the system. To question this order was unthinkable. He often told Sarah that the world was divided into two types of people, the ones who commanded and the ones who obeyed, and he made it clear which category she would one day fall into. Sarah's mother, Margaret, although more passive in her support of the system, shared her husband's belief in the importance of maintaining the family's reputation. She, too, was part of a world that had been built on the backs of enslaved people, and while she did not confront the issue head-on, she accepted it as a part of life. She took pride in her position, often organizing gatherings with other wealthy families in the area. The ladies of the South, with their fine dresses and elaborate social gatherings, had an unspoken understanding that their lives were built upon a foundation of exploitation. Margaret, though not as outspoken as her husband, was complicit in this system, for to question it was to risk losing everything. Yet for all their strength and conviction, the Harringtons were not immune to the cracks that were beginning to show in the walls of their world. The plantation, once thriving, had begun to wither under the weight of the war. The constant threat of Union soldiers encroaching on Southern territory weighed heavily on Richard's mind. He had always believed that the war would be won, that the South would rise again, but as the years passed and the conflict dragged on, the hope that had once burned so brightly began to dim. The war, which he had once viewed as a righteous cause, now seemed like an interminable nightmare, one that threatened to consume everything he had worked for. It was in this environment of increasing tension, both internal and external, that Sarah's world would begin to unravel. As the youngest member of the family, she had been shielded from the full scope of the war's impact. But the arrival of Elijah, a wounded runaway slave from a neighboring plantation, would soon change all of that. His presence on the Harrington estate marked the beginning of a shift in Sarah's perspective, a shift that would take her from the sheltered world of privilege to the harsh reality of the choices her family had made. Sarah's encounter with Elijah would expose the deep divides in her family's belief system and force her to confront the legacy of her own upbringing. The once unquestioned rules of her world would begin to crumble as she found herself in a moral dilemma that neither her father nor her mother could have ever imagined. The plantation, once a sanctuary of power and security, would become a battleground of conflicting loyalties and values, with Sarah caught in the middle of a war that was far more personal than any external conflict. The deeper Sarah became entangled in the secret she was keeping, the more the Harrington family's carefully constructed world began to shift. The relationship between Sarah and her father, once defined by respect and obedience, would become fraught with tension as the moral foundation of their world began to fracture. And as the conflict between the North and the South continued to rage, the personal battle within the walls of the Harrington plantation would take on a significance far greater than Sarah could have ever imagined. The choices she made in those months would not only define her own future but would leave an indelible mark on the history of Edgewood, a legacy that would be remembered long after the last stone of the crumbling plantation had fallen. Elijah had not planned on running. He hadn't planned on being caught either. His escape had been a desperate, last-ditch effort, spurred by fear and the instinct to survive. He had been born into slavery on a neighboring plantation, forced to labor under the scorching southern sun, his days spent picking cotton, his nights filled with the ache of exhaustion. The work had been endless, the punishment for the slightest mistake harsh and unforgiving. For most of his life, Elijah had believed that this was all there was to the world, that the fields, the overseers, the constant, unrelenting oppression, were his fate, something inevitable. But that belief had begun to erode over time. The war had changed things. The Confederate cause, which had once seemed so powerful and certain, had begun to falter. Rumors of freedom, of a life beyond the fields, whispered through the enslaved community, carried on the wind like the smoke from a distant fire. Elijah had heard these rumors all his life, but they had always felt like stories, abstract, distant, things for other people to chase. But then, one fateful night, the Confederate patrols grew more aggressive. Overseers were more brutal. The whips felt sharper, the threats more immediate. The mood on the plantation had shifted, and Elijah had known in his heart that staying any longer would mean certain death, whether from the war, the constant threat of punishment, or the brutality of a system that saw him as nothing more than property. He had heard the stories of runaways, those who had tried and failed to escape, and those who had succeeded. Some of the successful ones had made it across the Mason-Dixon line to freedom in the North, to Canada, to the Union-controlled territories. Others had disappeared into the forests or swamps, never to be seen again. But for Elijah, there was no choice. He had to try. The night of his escape had been filled with tension. His heart had pounded in his chest as he quietly slipped from his quarters, his only possession a small bundle of food and a handful of coins he had stolen from the overseer's stash. His escape was not a grand, heroic adventure, it was the quiet, terrifying movement of a man trying to outrun the hounds of hell. The night was dark, and the sounds of his breath and the rustling of leaves seemed deafening in the silence. The woods he had to cross were dense and unfamiliar, filled with the distant calls of nocturnal creatures and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. He had no map, no clear destination, just the instinct to move, to run, to survive. His plan was simple: get as far as possible, move under the cover of darkness, and hopefully find someone, anyone, who could help him. He didn't know where he would go once the morning light broke, only that he could not stay. His chances of survival were slim, but to stay would mean certain death, so he pressed on. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and fear. Elijah made his way through the forests, sometimes walking, sometimes hiding during the day and moving at night, using the stars to guide him. The weather was unkind. The summer heat drained him, and his body grew weaker with each passing day. His clothes became tattered and soaked with sweat and rain, but he kept moving, driven by the sheer will to escape. He didn't know if he was being followed. He didn't know if the patrols were out looking for him. He didn't know if there were bloodhounds on his trail. He only knew that he had to keep moving. It wasn't until the fourth night that he saw a flicker of hope. He had been making his way through a thick grove of trees when he caught sight of the faint glow of light ahead. It was a small house, tucked in a secluded corner of the landscape, just a humble structure, more of a shack than a home, surrounded by dense underbrush. His heart leapt in his chest as he approached cautiously. Could it be that someone had made it out here, someone who might help him? Or was it just another trap, another dead end in his desperate flight? He approached the house with trepidation, hoping that whoever lived there might take pity on him, that they might recognize his need, his desperation. He didn't know if it was a safe house for runaways or just a lonely cabin, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He needed help. His body was starting to give out, his wounds from running through the brush had become infected, and he was losing the ability to keep himself moving. He needed to find shelter, to find someone who could help him rest and recover before he made another move. As he crept closer, the door of the cabin opened, and a figure emerged, small, fragile, a girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, but her eyes were wide and full of an intensity that betrayed a wisdom far beyond her years. Elijah froze, unsure whether to run or approach her. But she didn't move toward him aggressively, instead, she merely looked at him, her gaze steady, assessing. For a moment, there was only silence, the night air heavy with the tension of this unexpected encounter. Then, in a voice softer than he had expected, the girl spoke. "You're looking for refuge," she said, her words cautious but firm. It wasn't a question, more of a statement of fact. Elijah hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest, but the girl didn't wait for an answer. She simply nodded toward the cabin. "Come inside, before someone sees you." Elijah didn't need any more encouragement. He staggered forward, his legs buckling as he collapsed into the small cabin. The girl closed the door behind him, locking it quickly. She didn't ask him who he was or why he was running. She didn't ask him anything at all. She simply brought him water, sat him down, and tended to his wounds with an efficiency that surprised him. Elijah had no idea who this girl was or why she was willing to help him, but in that moment, none of it mattered. He was safe, for the time being. As the night wore on, he began to understand the gravity of what had happened. This girl, this child, had made a choice. She had risked her own life to help him, a fugitive slave, when anyone else in her position would have turned him in. He didn't know if she had a family, or if she was alone, but her decision had changed everything. She had crossed a line, one that few would dare to cross in a world built on the principles of the South's entrenched system of slavery. The girl didn't speak much during the hours that followed, but Elijah was grateful for her silence. He needed time to recover, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that his fate, for the moment, was in the hands of a child whose courage far exceeded his own. He could not have known it then, but this moment would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would find himself not only fighting for his own survival but also caught in a far greater struggle, one that would unravel secrets, defy the traditions of his world, and change the course of history. The girl, Sarah Harrington, would never have imagined the role she would play in his escape, nor the path their lives would take together. But in that cabin, in the stillness of the night, Elijah found the first glimmer of hope he had seen in years. And for Sarah, a decision had been made that would alter the course of her own life, one that would challenge everything she had been taught, everything she had believed, and ultimately, everything she thought she knew about herself. The days that followed were shrouded in a kind of anxious silence, a tense peace that hovered over the Harrington estate like a cloud ready to burst. The decision Sarah had made to shelter Elijah, the runaway slave she had hidden away in the back room of the plantation house, was not one she took lightly. In the quiet of the night, when the plantation seemed to hold its breath, Sarah would often lie awake in the darkness, her mind racing with a mixture of guilt and fear. What if her father found out? What if the overseers discovered Elijah hiding in the room she had sealed off with a heavy wooden door, the only space that was hidden enough to keep him out of sight? Richard Harrington, Sarah's father, was a man who had always demanded obedience, first from his slaves, and later, as Sarah grew older, from his children. His presence loomed over the household like a storm cloud, and Sarah, despite her growing unease with the world around her, had learned to stay out of his way. Her mother, Margaret, was no help. She was distant, preoccupied with the appearance of propriety in their social circles, and had little interest in what happened behind the closed doors of the family home unless it reflected poorly on her own status. No, Sarah was alone in this, carrying a burden that no one else in the household seemed to notice, or at least not care enough to address. Every day that Elijah stayed hidden was another day she had to live with the weight of the secret. She could feel the strain of it creeping into every interaction with her family. Her father, though outwardly preoccupied with the decline of the plantation and the shifting tides of the war, had a sharp eye for anything that didn't fit into the neat structure of his life. And the longer Elijah remained hidden, the more Sarah felt the pressure mounting, like a storm ready to break. It wasn't long before Sarah began to notice small, subtle changes in the way her family behaved. At dinner, her father's once commanding presence had softened, but only in the way that suggested something was wrong. His temper, never far from the surface, flared more easily. The tension of the war had seeped into every aspect of life on the plantation. Sarah could feel the collective sense of dread that had taken over the house, and yet no one spoke of it. The slaves worked with even less enthusiasm than before, their movements slower, more deliberate. Sarah wondered if they, too, had sensed the shift, if they had felt the weight of impending change hanging in the air. But it was not just the household that was affected. The town of Edgewood, which had always been a place of quiet, unspoken rules, was beginning to feel the strain of the Civil War as well. The whispers of Union soldiers encroaching on Southern territory grew louder, and the specter of a Northern invasion loomed larger every day. The town's residents, once united under the banner of the Confederacy, now found themselves divided, each person torn between loyalty to the South and the creeping realization that the war was no longer a distant conflict, it was on their doorstep. At night, Sarah would often sit in her room, the dim glow of a candle flickering beside her, and listen to the sounds of the plantation settling into its own uneasy rhythm. The creaks of the old house seemed louder in the silence of the night. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the trees, a mournful, endless sound that seemed to echo the turmoil inside Sarah's heart. She had no idea what she was doing anymore, what had possessed her to make such a dangerous decision. But one thing was clear, her life was no longer her own. The decision to hide Elijah had set her on a path that she could not walk back from. Sarah's interactions with the other members of her family had become strained. Her father, who had always been distant, now seemed to carry an air of suspicion about him. He asked fewer questions, but his eyes lingered longer than they should have, and when he did speak, there was an edge to his voice that Sarah had never heard before. Margaret, her mother, seemed oblivious to the mounting tension. She was lost in her own world, consumed with the details of the estate's decline and the rumors swirling around the war. She never asked why Sarah seemed so distant, why she seemed preoccupied, always glancing over her shoulder as though waiting for someone to burst in. And yet, even as Sarah hid the truth from her family, the world outside the walls of the plantation began to close in. The war was no longer something that could be ignored. The Confederate army was losing ground, and the Union soldiers were drawing nearer to Edgewood with each passing day. Sarah could feel the pressure building, both from within her own family and from the encroaching storm outside. The plantation, once an untouchable fortress, now seemed like a crumbling ruin, its walls no longer able to keep the world at bay. Sarah's life had always been defined by the rules of her family, the expectations placed upon her as a woman of the South. But now, everything had changed. The decision she had made to hide Elijah had shattered the very foundation of her world. She had crossed a line that no one, especially someone of her social standing, should ever have crossed. But in doing so, she had awakened something in herself, a courage she had never known she possessed. One evening, as Sarah crept down the narrow hallway to the back room where Elijah was hiding, she heard the sound of footsteps in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The last thing she needed was for one of the overseers to stumble upon the room and discover what she had been hiding. She pressed her ear to the door, listening intently, waiting for the footsteps to pass. But they didn't. Instead, they grew louder, closer. Sarah's pulse quickened. She glanced over her shoulder, the cold grip of fear settling over her. The door to the room creaked open, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her father stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the silence between them seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Richard's eyes flicked to the closed door, then back to Sarah. His gaze narrowed. "What is going on here, Sarah?" His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down her spine. "I've seen the way you've been acting lately. You've been avoiding me. You've been keeping secrets." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? How could she explain the truth? How could she tell him that she had been hiding a runaway slave, someone who represented everything he stood against? Her father took a step forward, his expression darkening. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm, almost gentle. "I know what you've been doing. I don't know why you've done it, but I need you to understand something. There are no second chances in this world. You've crossed a line, and there's no going back." Sarah stood frozen in place, her heart racing. She had no idea what her father intended to do. Would he turn her in? Would he expose her? The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, suffocating her. The world she had known, the world of privilege, of safety, of unquestioned loyalty to her family, was slipping away. And in that moment, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The days following her father's confrontation were filled with a quiet, mounting terror. Sarah had never before felt the full weight of her family's expectations bear down on her as she did in those moments after her father had spoken those chilling words. She had crossed a line, and she could see now, more clearly than ever, the consequences of her actions. Her father, Richard Harrington, was not a man to be trifled with. His reputation in the town of Edgewood, built on years of dominance, wealth, and unwavering support for the Southern cause, was formidable. The Harrington name was synonymous with power, and for Sarah, as a daughter of that name, there had always been an unspoken contract, a contract of obedience and loyalty to a system that valued tradition and the status quo above all else. But now, that contract was beginning to unravel, and she was at the center of it. Her father's gaze, cold and sharp, lingered long after he had spoken. Sarah had never felt so small under his scrutiny. She had always known he was capable of cruelty, capable of holding fast to his beliefs without any compassion for those who stood in opposition to them. But she had never imagined that she, his own daughter, could become the object of that cruelty. She had grown up sheltered in the wealth and protection of the Harrington estate, her world confined to the walls of the grand plantation house, far removed from the struggles that others faced. And yet, in an instant, all of that had changed. The truth of her actions had become impossible to ignore, even for Sarah. She could no longer reconcile the girl she had been with the woman she had become. She had made a choice, one that was unthinkable, one that had put her at odds with everything she had been raised to believe. She had risked everything, her family's honor, her own safety, to protect a man whom society had condemned to a life of subjugation and misery. And now, she was trapped. She couldn't undo what she had done, nor could she undo the storm that was rapidly approaching. She was no longer the innocent child she had once been, she was a fugitive, a traitor to her family's cause. As Sarah retreated to her room, her mind raced with the implications of her father's words. The plantation, once a fortress of privilege and security, now felt like a prison. She could hear the muffled sounds of the house as it settled around her, distant voices, the clink of silverware from the dining room, the soft tread of footsteps in the hallways. But all of it felt distant, disconnected from her reality. The world she had known, the world of comfort and safety, was slipping through her fingers like sand. It wasn't just her father she feared now. It was the world outside, the world of men like him, the world that upheld the system of oppression she had been born into. Her heart pounded as she thought of Elijah, still hiding in the room downstairs. She had promised him sanctuary, and yet now, with her father's words ringing in her ears, that promise seemed like a dangerous fantasy. Every step she took felt like a betrayal of her family's blood, a step further away from the world she had once known. She could no longer ignore the gravity of the situation, she had taken a stand, and now she was facing the consequences. The days that followed felt like an endless descent into fear and uncertainty. Sarah's interactions with her father became colder, more strained. Richard Harrington, for all his bluster and bravado, had a way of making those around him feel insignificant, as if they were mere pieces on a board, to be moved at his whim. Sarah, once his beloved daughter, now felt as though she had become something else, a nuisance, a disappointment, a symbol of everything he had worked to protect. She had betrayed him, and he would not forgive her easily. The tension in the house grew palpable. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, seemed to echo the growing unease that had taken root within the walls of the mansion. Richard was becoming more agitated, more unpredictable. His temper flared with increasing frequency, and his conversations with his wife, Margaret, became more strained. Sarah overheard snippets of their conversations in the quiet hours of the night, when she had hoped the house would fall into silence. Margaret's voice, soft and pleading, was always at odds with Richard's harsh tones, but it was clear to Sarah that her mother was powerless to change his mind. Margaret, for all her grace and poise, had never been a force to be reckoned with, not in the way that Richard was. She was a woman of appearances, a woman who clung to the status quo out of necessity, not conviction. And so, Sarah was left alone to wrestle with the consequences of her actions. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She could no longer hide behind the walls of the plantation, sheltered from the brutal realities of the world she had once been a part of. The war, the rebellion, the enslaved people she had once viewed as mere shadows, they were all crashing into her life, demanding that she face the truth. On the third day after her father's confrontation, Sarah found herself in the garden, standing among the flowers that once brought her comfort. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the estate, and the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and roses. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, but instead, it felt like a quiet before the storm. As Sarah stood there, her hands trembling slightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that her father was watching her from the windows above. She could feel his gaze, even from this distance, pressing down on her like a weight. Her mind kept returning to Elijah. She had promised to protect him, and she had done so without thinking of the consequences. Now, as the world outside her family's estate seemed to grow more chaotic, Sarah couldn't escape the truth that was becoming more and more apparent: her actions had set in motion forces beyond her control. What had begun as a simple act of defiance had turned into something far greater, something that she could no longer escape. She could hear her father's words echoing in her mind, the promise of punishment, the threat of exposure. He had already made it clear that he knew about Elijah, and soon, others would know, too. The decision to hide Elijah had been impulsive, born of an instinct Sarah didn't fully understand at the time. But now, as the days wore on and the weight of the situation bore down on her, she began to understand that it wasn't just about Elijah. It was about everything she had been raised to believe, everything she had ever been taught. It was about the moral fabric of the world she had been born into, a fabric that was now unraveling before her eyes. She could no longer deny that the world of privilege, of tradition, and of unquestioning loyalty to her family's cause was built on the backs of people like Elijah, the very people she had been taught to see as inferior, as property. As Sarah stood in the garden, the winds began to pick up, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the air. She could hear the distant sound of hooves approaching, Union soldiers, perhaps, or maybe the overseers from the neighboring estates, coming to inspect her family's property. The war was no longer distant, it had arrived at her doorstep. The tension in the air was thick with the promise of change, and Sarah realized that she could no longer stay hidden in the shadows. She had made a choice, and now she would have to live with it, for better or for worse. She could no longer pretend that she was safe, that her family's wealth could protect her from the consequences of her actions. The breaking point was coming, and there was no escaping it. The life Sarah had known was slipping away, and in its place was something far darker, far more uncertain. As the days wore on, Sarah felt a strange mix of dread and resolve settle deep within her. The air around the plantation was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. Her father, Richard Harrington, had always been a force of nature, a man whose will was ironclad and whose power had always been unquestioned. But now, that power seemed brittle, like the final threads of a fraying rope. The world she had been born into, her father's world, was crumbling before her eyes, and no amount of wealth, no amount of power, could hold it all together anymore. It was only a matter of time before her father made his move, before he realized the full extent of what she had done, and Sarah could feel it in her bones. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the trees, felt like a harbinger of doom. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on her, trapping her in a web of her own making. And yet, despite the looming danger, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty: she could never go back. The decision to hide Elijah had been impulsive, driven by something deep inside her that she had never fully understood. But now, as the reality of the situation set in, she realized that the choice she had made was not just about Elijah. It was about the very fabric of her identity. She had been raised to believe in the superiority of her family, to believe that the world was divided into masters and slaves, that some were meant to rule and others were meant to serve. But Elijah had shattered that worldview, forcing her to see the truth about the system that had sustained her family for generations. She could no longer ignore the injustice, the brutality, and the lies that had been woven into the foundation of everything she had ever known. The decision to protect Elijah, to hide him from her father and the overseers, was not just an act of defiance, it was an act of rebellion against the very life she had been born into. And as the days passed, as the walls of the plantation seemed to close in tighter, Sarah realized that her rebellion was no longer just about her, it was about something far larger than herself. It was about the future, about what kind of world she wanted to live in, and whether she could ever escape the shadow of her father's legacy. It was late one night, as the wind howled outside and the plantation house settled into its usual silence, that Sarah made her way down the hall toward the room where Elijah was hidden. She had grown accustomed to the nightly ritual of checking on him, bringing him food and water, and ensuring that no one suspected a thing. But tonight, there was a new urgency in her movements. She could feel it in the air, like the heavy pressure before a storm. Her father had been acting strangely in the past few days, more distant, more intense, like a man on the edge of something, ready to snap. Sarah didn't know how much longer she could keep the secret. She didn't know how much longer Elijah could stay hidden in the shadows, living like a fugitive in his own home. When she entered the room, she found Elijah sitting by the window, his back turned toward her, his face obscured by the dim light of the candle she had brought with her. He looked thinner than the last time she had seen him, his clothes more ragged, his eyes tired but still filled with a quiet strength. There was something about him that made her feel both vulnerable and alive, as if he were the only thing that had ever made her question the world she had been born into. "Elijah," Sarah whispered softly, stepping closer to him. "Are you all right?" He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, they just looked at each other in silence. There was so much unsaid between them, so much fear, so much uncertainty. And yet, in that silence, Sarah felt a bond between them, a bond that was unspoken, but undeniable. "I'm surviving," Elijah replied quietly, his voice low but steady. "But I can't stay here much longer. Your father, he's bound to find out. And when he does..." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the thought of her father discovering Elijah's presence. She knew how ruthless her father could be, how determined he was to protect the system that had given him power. If Richard found out that she had been hiding a runaway slave, it would be more than just a betrayal of family, it would be a betrayal of everything he had fought for. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances. "I won't let that happen," Sarah said, her voice more firm than she felt. "I won't let him hurt you." Elijah stood up slowly, his face solemn. "You can't protect me forever, Sarah. I don't want to be the reason your family falls apart." "Then what do we do?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She hadn't thought that far ahead. She had been so focused on keeping Elijah safe, so focused on protecting him from her father, that she hadn't considered the possibility of a future, of an escape, of a way out. She was trapped in the same way Elijah was, only her chains were invisible, forged by the expectations of her family, by the constraints of the world she had been born into. There was a long silence between them, the weight of the question hanging in the air like a thick fog. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There's a way out, but it's dangerous. It's not just about running anymore. It's about finding someone who can help us, someone who has the power to make sure you and I both get out of here safely. But that kind of help, it's not free. And the cost is high." Sarah looked at him, her heart pounding. "Who?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something he couldn't quite see. "There's a network. People who help those who run. They call themselves the Underground Railroad. They don't ask questions. But getting there isn't easy. It's dangerous. And we can't do it alone." The mention of the Underground Railroad hit Sarah like a thunderclap. She had heard whispers of it, rumors, half-forgotten tales of slaves making their way north to freedom. But she had never truly understood what it meant, what it involved, until now. She had never imagined that she, a daughter of the Southern elite, would be involved in something like this, something so far removed from her reality, so dangerous, so radical. But now, with Elijah's words hanging in the air between them, Sarah realized that this was no longer a choice. This was a path she had to follow, a path that led to freedom, not just for Elijah, but for herself as well. The ties that had bound her to her father's world, the world of privilege, tradition, and oppression, were beginning to break, piece by piece. "I'll help you," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes to get you to safety." Elijah's eyes softened slightly, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. "I don't want you to get hurt, Sarah." "I won't be hurt," she replied, the words coming out stronger than she had meant. "I'm already lost. I've already made my choice." The weight of those words hung heavy between them, and in that moment, Sarah knew that her life was no longer her own. She had made a dangerous alliance with Elijah, a man she barely knew, yet somehow understood in a way she never had anyone else. And as the world outside the plantation continued to shift, as the winds of war howled louder and closer, Sarah knew that she had taken the first step down a path that could never be undone. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back now. The days leading up to the escape were filled with a quiet, almost unbearable tension. Sarah knew that the stakes had grown far higher than she had ever anticipated. The decision to help Elijah escape, to get him to the Underground Railroad and into safety, had now become a battle not just for his freedom, but for her very survival. Every moment felt like a countdown, every whispered word, every furtive glance, carrying the weight of the consequences should anything go wrong. Her father's watchful eyes had not eased since their last conversation. Richard Harrington, despite his cold, calculating demeanor, seemed to sense that something was amiss with Sarah. There were no direct confrontations, Richard was far too composed to show his hand so overtly, but the subtle shifts in his behavior were unmistakable. He grew quieter, more pensive, as if trying to untangle the growing tension in the house. Margaret, Sarah's mother, appeared oblivious to the danger. She remained preoccupied with the worsening state of the estate, the looming threat of Union forces, and the ever-deteriorating health of their slaves. The war had taken its toll on the family, and yet Sarah knew the real battle lay within the walls of their home. Elijah's presence was a spark in the tinderbox of the plantation, one that could set everything aflame if discovered. Each night, as Sarah made her way down to the hidden room where Elijah was waiting, she felt the gnawing fear tighten in her chest. The mansion, once a symbol of privilege and stability, now felt like a tomb. The silence in the halls was suffocating. There were times when Sarah thought she could hear footsteps outside her door, or the sound of someone moving in the shadows. The claustrophobia of her situation was almost too much to bear, but she kept moving forward. There was no other choice. She couldn't go back now. One night, Sarah found herself sitting with Elijah in the dimly lit room, a flickering candle casting long shadows on the walls. He looked more worn than she had seen him in days, his face drawn with exhaustion, his once shiny clothes now ragged and torn. Elijah had always been quiet, but lately, his silence felt heavier, more laden with the understanding of what was at stake. They both knew that time was running out. The whispers in town had grown louder, and the presence of Confederate soldiers was becoming more pronounced. The war was creeping closer, and with it, the likelihood of discovery. Every hour spent in the house was another hour they risked being found out. "I think it's time," Elijah finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath, a recognition of how dangerous the coming days would be. "We can't wait much longer." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard as she fought to keep her emotions in check. "I know. I've arranged everything. The way out is set. But it's going to be dangerous. If anything goes wrong, I won't be able to help you." Elijah's dark eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "I've known that since the moment you decided to hide me," he said quietly. "But I trust you. And if we're going to do this, we'll have to do it tonight. The storm clouds are gathering, Sarah. I can feel it." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing with 1,000 fears. She had planned the escape down to the smallest detail. The secret route to the woods behind the plantation, the safe house that had been arranged with the Underground Railroad, the old wagon that would be used to get Elijah out of sight. Everything was set. But no plan, no matter how carefully crafted, was foolproof. The world was too unpredictable. There were too many variables. The wind could change direction, the patrols could grow more vigilant, or worse, someone in the house could grow suspicious and alert her father. Sarah's heart was heavy with the knowledge that their chances of success were slim. And yet, there was no other choice. The risk of staying was far worse. "I'll meet you at the back door," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know the signal?" Elijah nodded. He knew the plan as well as she did. At midnight, when the household was asleep, Sarah would slip down to the back door, the one that led to the stables and out into the woods beyond. From there, they would move quickly, keeping to the shadows, using the cover of night to escape. Elijah had been prepared for this, but Sarah had no illusions about the danger. The woods were full of hazards, and there was no guarantee that the safe house would even be reachable. They would be vulnerable from the moment they left the mansion, exposed to every danger the night could throw at them. As the hour approached, Sarah's nerves became a tight knot in her chest. She had done everything she could to make sure their departure was flawless, but there were things she couldn't control. What if someone woke up and heard them? What if one of the overseers grew suspicious of Elijah's absence? And then, there was her father. What would Richard do when he realized she had helped Elijah escape? He would be furious, no doubt. The consequences for such a betrayal could be catastrophic, not just for her, but for the slaves on the plantation, for the family legacy. It would be a stain that could never be erased. The clock struck midnight, and the moment of reckoning arrived. Sarah slipped silently from her bed, careful not to disturb her mother, who lay in the room next door. The house was dark, the faint sounds of breathing and the distant rustle of the wind the only noises breaking the silence. Sarah's footsteps were quiet, purposeful, as she crept down the hallway, her heart beating in her ears. Every step felt like a small eternity. The air in the house seemed to thicken with each passing second. She could almost feel the presence of her father, could almost sense his awareness of what she was about to do, though he remained in his study, as he always did at this hour. She reached the back door and waited, her breath shallow in the cold night air. Through the cracked window, she could see Elijah's silhouette against the darkness. He was waiting too, watching for the signal. She felt a strange calmness wash over her as she realized there was no turning back now. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. With one last glance toward the house, Sarah opened the door just enough to slip through. The cool air of the night hit her like a wave, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to savor the freedom of it. But there was no time for reflection. She and Elijah had only moments before they would be exposed. They moved swiftly through the backyard, their feet barely making a sound as they crossed the familiar path that led to the stables. The wagon that had been arranged was waiting there, its wheels already greased for the journey. Elijah climbed into the back first, followed by Sarah, who helped him settle the blankets and straw over him to conceal his presence. There was no conversation now, only the grim understanding that this was the only chance they had. The horse, a sturdy mare that had been trained for this very purpose, snorted impatiently as Sarah climbed into the driver's seat. She clicked her tongue softly, urging the animal forward, and they began the long, slow trek through the darkened woods. The path was uneven, the wheels of the wagon creaking under the strain of the journey, but they had no choice but to keep moving. Every shadow, every rustling in the bushes, felt like an omen, a reminder of how fragile their escape was. As they neared the edge of the plantation, Sarah glanced back at the house. The dark silhouette of the mansion loomed behind them, a reminder of everything they were leaving behind. Everything she was leaving behind. The war, the family, the legacy. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt a profound sense of loss, a loss she could not yet understand, but one she knew she would never be able to undo. They were leaving, but the world they were stepping into was uncertain, dangerous. There was no guarantee of safety, no guarantee of success. But there was a glimmer of hope, an ember that, with any luck, would survive the night and burn brighter in the days to come. And for Sarah, that was enough. It had to be. The journey to the safe house was longer and more treacherous than Sarah had anticipated. The once familiar roads, now shrouded in the deepening darkness of the night, seemed to stretch on endlessly before them. Each mile felt like an eternity, each bump in the road a reminder of how precarious their situation was. The soft clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoed in the stillness of the woods, the only sound punctuating the silence that enveloped them. Sarah's heart beat heavily in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of what could go wrong at any moment. There was a constant pressure on her, an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders as they made their way further from the plantation. The further they went, the more she felt the distance from everything she had ever known, the family, the estate, the life she had been raised to live. It was a loss that was almost too painful to comprehend, but there was no turning back now. Elijah sat huddled beneath the blankets in the back of the wagon, his form barely visible in the darkness. His breathing was slow, even, but Sarah knew better than to believe he was sleeping. He was likely just as alert as she was, listening for any sign of danger, watching for any shadow in the trees that might indicate they were being followed. The air between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts, the fear of the unknown, the weight of the journey, and the promise of something they both hoped for but couldn't be certain of, safety. Sarah glanced up at the sky, where the stars blinked down like distant, cold witnesses to their actions. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the world seemed swallowed in darkness. This was the time of night when all of nature held its breath, when the night itself seemed like a living, breathing entity, watching, waiting. Sarah felt as though she was carrying a piece of that darkness with her, each step forward a risk that could end in disaster. The world she had left behind had been one of wealth and stability, a life where every decision was made within the safety of well-defined lines. But now, that world was gone. In its place was a new world, one where freedom was not given but fought for, where every moment felt like a battle. As the wagon moved along, Sarah could feel the tension between them, the unspoken knowledge that their time was running out. The closer they came to the safe house, the more anxious Sarah grew. She could feel the air growing heavier, more suffocating with every passing minute. What if they were too late? What if the network that Elijah had trusted to guide them to safety was compromised? What if someone had tipped off the authorities or the overseers? What if her father had somehow found out about their escape? The questions gnawed at her, unrelenting and painful. But there was no time to dwell on the what-ifs. They had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. There was no other option. They passed through dense forests, the trees looming like silent sentinels around them. The path was barely visible, only faintly marked by the overgrown trail that had once been used by travelers who sought to avoid the main roads.